think that is just about everybody on that. All right, so that song, I had to pick it because ever since I learned it, and I think we were doing that for Sunday school, and I can't remember if it was me or Serenity that picked that one out. But I fell in love with that song, and it was really awesome to see that family singing it together. All right, so as far as it goes with, this is just a continuation from Sunday night Bible study just for today. And as I go through the book of Job, we're going to be in Job chapter 4 today. And as I encourage, as we're going through, if you have any questions or comments at any time, please feel free to put them in the chat. I know the style of this study is a little different, but I want to make sure if I can help you understand things greater, I would like to be able to do so. And if I say things confusing, please, let me know, and we can always stop to talk about it. If I don't know an answer to something, I will tell you I have no clue. I got no problem with that. All right. So starting in Job chapter 4, I'm pretty sure we're familiar with the first couple of chapters, but in chapter 3, Job finally spoke, and that was after the 7 days and 7 nights of silence with his friends. And then so Job in chapter 3, the whole chapter is basically Job speaking of his desire to not be alive, or that he hadn't been born. And so when we hit Job chapter 4, we have Eliphaz the Temanite. He is going to respond to what Job has been saying. Now, of course, Eliphaz is from Teman, and that's just an Edomite city, they say, is named after the grandson of Esau. And it's said that the inhabitants of Teman were very wise. Looking through and studying on that, Eliphaz, when it comes to the three friends, he represents human wisdom because he was a Temanite. There's 2 other verses that kind of talk about Teman. Jeremiah 49:7 and Obadiah 1:8-9, just for references. I'm not going to go ahead and read those today, but there's just those 2 spots for the most part that speak about that city alone. So as we get into this dialogue, Job's friends, in their minds, they're going to give Job this wise counsel to help him. So as their friends come into this conversation, they are not coming into this conversation with hate for Job, because they just sat there for 7 days and nights in silence with him. And again, they traveled together to meet Job after they learned of this. They left everything at home, and some scholars, since we don't know exactly, they say where exactly Job, that land was, that they estimate they could have traveled up to many hundreds of miles just to see him. But regardless, they left all that, left everything that they were doing in their life to meet Job and to go be by his side. And one thing is, as we go through this, we're going to see that Job's friends at times say some very truthful things, but they're going to be used in the wrong context. We'll see that as we go forth in that. So we're going to kind of go through verses in little segments. All right, sweet. All right, thanks, violinist. So we're going to start with the first 2 verses on here, and this is where he starts at. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, "If one attempts a word with you, will you become weary? But who can withhold himself from speaking?" And so Job's friends were shocked by what Job said, as we read in the previous chapter. And these are the first words that Job spoke after the silence. Because in the following verses, we're going to see that Eliphaz states Job had counseled the afflicted, that Job had answers, and he feared God. So for them to hear Job, who would console others in this area, to them, this would have been shocking for them to hear. And now Eliphaz, from his statement, he doesn't want to add any affliction to Job by his words. So he states in that first line, if anyone attempts a word with you, will you become weary? So he's saying basically, if I speak, will it produce harm on you? Or to say, will you take it as unkind, or will it cause you more pain? And as he adds in that second line, he says, but who can withhold himself from speaking? Just as to say, sorry, but I must say this to you. And, well, I'm going to go ahead and throw some notes once in a while in here. I'm not too trained on that just yet. But who can withhold himself from speaking to you? And so with what was being said, when you think about it, that's quite a natural thought for a friend who witnesses another friend, or you could say a brother or sister, going through a horrible time. I don't want to make things worse for you, but I have to say what I have to say to you. It's very natural to want to give counsel and console a person in those times. And so Eliphaz is saying, I can't be silent. And can you blame him for being that way? So kind of put this in other words is, after being in silence with Job that long, even without being in that silence with Job that long, if you heard what Job had said, it would be hard to sit and not speak for that long, one thing that to also kind of think, and I'm kind of going a little jumbled on this part, but one thing to think about is, since we know, as we're going to go through, that Job's friends think that Job had sinned because of the affliction he was going through, that those 7 days and 7 nights, that his friends may have been torn up a little bit in their mind over the sin they think he committed. But back to the point of being quiet and it being hard to speak and say something, it not being, okay, let me do that over again. I'm twisting myself up. So when Eliphaz says, I can't be silent, can you blame him? Let's kind of put that into perspective. All right, so let's think about anybody here in this room. And let's just say there's a trial or tribulation that's happening, regardless of a trial and tribulation. If you were to hear anybody in this room say something along the lines like Job did, where Job said, I hate the day I was born, I wish I was never born, along those lines. If you heard somebody here say, you know what, it'd be so peaceful if I had died, I wouldn't feel like this, why can't death just come already? Would you be able to keep quiet after hearing that? Would you be able to hold back your thoughts from escaping your mouth? Yeah, absolutely not. And I would venture to say that most or anyone I know would want to say something. I would just hope that with any way you go about it, of course, it would be in gentleness. As we're going to go through Eliphaz's words, I do 100% believe that, he's not yelling, he's not being angry, he's saying it in a gentle spirit as he goes along and speaks to Job. Now, even though he speaks in a gentle manner, he kind of comes, as I would say, swinging out the gate a little bit with what he has to say. And so in verses 3-5, he says, surely you have instructed many, and you have strengthened weak hands. Your words have upheld him who is stumbling, and you have strengthened the feeble knees. But now it comes upon you, and you are weary. It touches you, and you are troubled. Now, again, I was saying Eliphaz is, using this mild-mannered tone when he's talking to Job. But keeping in mind the severity of Job's afflictions, of what's going on, Eliphaz is basically telling Job that he is being a hypocrite. that he contradicts himself. So he's pointing at Job, and he's pointing at Job and saying, on one hand, Job, you've been counseling and instructing many people in the times that they're in trouble, in times of their need, and times that, of their great trials and tribulations. And, that was godly wisdom. Job feared God. It was wisdom that would produce hope in them. So on one hand, you counseled, instructed many people in this area. But on the other hand, Job, now you're being afflicted. You're in a time of need, but you can't follow your own advice. Thank you, Dodie. I'm glad that kind of brings something out for you. There's something to, now later on, we'll get into some other tones that they use. It gets a little more, as I said earlier, heated. But Eliphaz right here does bring out something that I believe here should be pointed out, which is a profound truth. Granted, I'll talk more about kind of the way Eliphaz is doing it, which I find to be a little more on the negative side, but where Eliphaz kind of points out, Job, you do this, you counsel people in this area, but this area is now affecting you, and now you can't follow what you've been saying. And so there is that truth in there that I wanted to point out. Giving sound counsel and wisdom is one thing when you're giving it to somebody else. That's easy to do. But it is a whole different ball game to follow the same counsel that you give others. I'm just going to go ahead and read off my notes and put them into Discord real quick. All right. So it's a lot easier to give advice than to follow it yourself. And that's when the true test happens. So I can get up on the pulpit and speak on reliance on God and speak on not worrying. And honestly, I do that quite a bit because that was one of the areas I struggled in the most, especially when I wasn't a Christian. And, I can speak on God's wisdom to people who battle worry and anxiety, people who are struggling or afflicted and overwhelmed, worrying about life's situations, about the uncertainty of life. But when life situations come my way, which bring me uncertainty, can I follow what I advise? And do I practice what I preach? Or basically, when it happens to me, do I crumble and give in to worry and anxiety and let them run my life? It's one of those, I say it's a profound truth because it's one of those things that we see here that Eliphaz brings out. Because there's been those times where, I can look at myself as a kind of a hypocrite. Hey, there you go, Dodie. Absolutely. She's been reading my notes. You are absolutely right, Dodie, and we'll get into that here very shortly, but they would be singing a different tune. And I know Job speaks on it later as well and brings that out. And there definitely is truth to there being somebody speaking on a matter that they don't understand because they haven't experienced it. What would my life say if I said nothing at all? Violinist, I don't think I'm understanding exactly. Is that kind of like a rhetorical question? No, not rhetorical. That's the wrong word. You can only feel the pain of others when it is personally felt, even though you try. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. There's that deeper understanding to where you truly understand what they're going through because you've felt that same pain. And as, Eliphaz, all of his friends, they definitely have this warped view a bit on society, and it doesn't seem like they've experienced much of close to what Job is going through. It means our actions, how we react and act speaks louder than our mere words. Okay, absolutely. I'd agree with that completely. Our actions, I know, I know they used to say our actions speak louder than words. Um, but I think biblically speaking, our actions need to match our words, because even Christ speaks about our actions, but he does put a huge emphasis on our words, because our words are a product of what's in our heart. But our actions are too, right? Um, you should never say, I know what you feel unless you've been through it. Yeah. And then psalmist, let's see what we got here. Our infirmities become the black velvet on which the diamond, yep, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Absolutely. And we've seen that quite a bit in the book of Proverbs, as we've been going through that too. And so there's been quite a few sermons on the mouth. There's no learning sympathy except by suffering, and I'll be studied from the book. It must be written on the heart. That, yeah. And men will never become great in theology until they become great in suffering. And there's a lot of profound truths in that in itself as well. Absolutely, psalmist. It does bring that out. It gives you this greater understanding once you've gone through it. It's kind of like, and this is probably a bad illustration, but it's like you go to a job, for example, and then you have days of watching videos and reading books, or say somebody who studies in a field, they can have all this head knowledge, but until they actually go out and experience it or apply it, whatever it may be, they don't truly understand how to do things. Again, not the greatest illustration, but same concept that's in there. All right. Now, while y'all are typing, I'm going to go ahead and speak on verse 5, because we were looking at that, and I spoke about a truth coming from this passage about, him strengthening others, but him not being able to follow his own advice. But there's something in here where Eliphaz says, but now it comes upon you, and you are weary. It touches you, and you are troubled. And that's definitely a statement used that we would look at and think, maybe that wasn't the best choice of words, judging by Job's circumstances, because that part right there from Eliphaz is quite insulting, I would call it, and hurtful. They're not putting themselves in Job's shoes. Again, as you said, they haven't experienced it. As we just said, my next part of my notes was exactly what y'all are talking about. It's easier for Eliphaz to say what he says in his position, but Eliphaz says it touches you and you are troubled, as if, calamity just gave him a little poke and a nudge, as if what Job is going through isn't all that much. So Job's affliction here is very, very downplayed. Oh, yes, the verse. Sorry, my assistant nudged me. Okay. True wisdom comes from experience, not from book knowledge. Amen. Hallelujah. And praise the Lord. IT, that's wisdom right there. Very correct. Blessed be the Lord God our Father, comfort us in all our affliction. Absolutely. Thank you for posting those verses, psalmist. And violinist, yep. That goes along with the IT, what IT had said right after. So, Jody, if you're referring to what I said about the verse, the reason I say that, in a sense, it's a little bit on the, I guess you could say, I called it hurtful and I called it insulting. I say that because I guess the way, as I read it and as I've studied it, when he says it touches you and you are troubled, I don't think that his friend is really taking into account the severity of what Job is going through at that moment. Okay, gotcha. And that goes about to what we were just speaking on about them not experiencing it. But even though, like, I don't think he's angry or mad as he's saying it, but it's basically Eliphaz is what he's saying is to say, Job, it just started and you already gave up what you believe and you lost yourself so fast. Kind of as to say to him, you didn't even really put up a fight. And so when I was thinking on this, though, I was thinking that Job, lasted longer in this than I feel like you could expect from most or really all people. And that's considering Job's reactions, especially after chapter 1 and chapter 2. And, even in chapter 3, yes, he curses the day of his birth, but he doesn't get mad at God or curse him.
What are you doing, puppy?
And I read your post there, Thomas. Thank you for posting that one. All right, so we're going to quick speak on verse 6, which I think has some more good stuff in there for us. So Eliphaz says to him, is not your reverence your confidence, and the integrity of your ways your hope? And so integrity is kind of like moral uprightness.
What are you doing?
So this would be along like the lines of counsel and advice that you could say Job was giving to others as well. It's not a bad thing for Eliphaz to point this out. So it's like, Job, where does your whole being lay? Is it in the fear of God? And that's what he's speaking of by your reverence being your confidence. This is where I got to post more of my notes because I remembered. All right. So Job is faced with a question of his character. Where does his whole being lay? Is it in the fear of God? The questions posed would make Job faced with really this thought. Job, are you trusting God, or are you focused elsewhere and looking for something else? And then I wanted to bring an application for us. And really, kind of those questions are for us. We can talk a big game, and actually you had just spoken on our actions, but we can talk a big game, but do our actions in trying times show we trust God as much as we say we do? Or are we filled with empty words? We may go through some small trials or even minor inconveniences, and our trust and confidence is in Him. And does it show? And our trust and confidence is Him, and it shows. But even when we go through small things and our trust and confidence shows, does it stay strong, or does it begin to go away as a trial becomes greater, or as more piles up? Do we keep looking towards God, or do we look away and begin to crumble? And I would say for many Christians today, we could face something small in comparison to Job, something 1/10 or 1/20th the affliction of Job, and be in a place where we lose sight on God for a period of time. And there's been, I will speak on this one from personal experience, there's been times where the big things, for me it's the big things. The big things happen and I'm focused on God and I'm like, cool, no problem. And you could ask my wife. I began to worry at times or stress over things, but they ended up being the smallest little things. Would I be wrong? All right. Huh? Yeah. Anyways, well, at least I know that like the bigger things I've been good with, but sometimes smaller things, all of a sudden the mind kind of goes out a little bit for even a period of time. Even if it be 10 minutes, 2 hours, or 2 days. And sometimes it's definitely taken God to use somebody else to smack me upside the head or whatever He brings about. good to ask ourselves, being old and watching how people I love and know face end of life and other trauma and people they love and how they react does either point to trust, faith in God or self. That's a big thing, Dodie, on end of life when it comes to showing trust and faith in God, because sometimes at the end of life, people can get fearful about what's going to happen, or, because we haven't experienced it. And what came to mind is I usually say when it comes to end of life stuff is that the Christian knows what's going to happen. The Christian has no fear in what's going to happen after death. They shouldn't have any fear because we know how it plays out and how it goes. It's essentially thinking that we walk through a door, even though for us it can still be like, we haven't experienced it, so I can say it's that easy. But what I can say is, though, what came to mind is that anybody who doesn't trust in God, as much in Proverbs proves this point as well in the beginning of the book, that those who don't trust in God, the wicked, they will have fear, and regardless, and one of those fears that they will have is of death. So you can have anybody as fearless as it may seem about death throughout their whole life, but once the moments of death comes upon them, they have uncertainty and unsurety of what's going to happen afterwards, that they do become extremely fearful of death and even don't want it to come and try to do anything to prevent it. I had a neighbor, or was it, no, not a neighbor, but I know somebody whose parent was extremely fearful of what was to come. And at the Salvation Army just the other week, I was speaking to a man, and he said that I believe it was his brother, grew up in a church and then left it and was just like, aliens put us on this planet. And now that person now is facing death. And he says that his brother is just scared beyond all belief. And he's just worried, scared, and fearful. And that's just an absolute truth of anybody who's outside of Christ. Kind of got on a rabbit trail. I couldn't help it. You brought something else out. Aliens. It's like, what's his name? Actually, you know what? I'm not going to keep going on that one because I'll get lost for 10 minutes. It was a prominent atheist that believed the world came out of nothing. And then he changed his mind because that was so absurd. He wanted to say that aliens may have dropped what was needed for us to exist. Anyways, so anything to not say God created everything. Apple plus apple equals what? I don't know what that means, Thomas. 2 apples equal a Mac? I don't know. It's an alien. Oh, okay. Gotcha. All right, and then not that we dare to classify or compare ourselves with some of those who are commending themselves, but when they measure themselves by one another, compare themselves to one another, they are without understanding. All right. Thank you for that, Psalmist. And then Serenity. I think for me, I don't like the idea of pain or something like that before death. And that's okay. You don't have to like the idea of pain. We were just at the assisted living center yesterday, and a lot of them are in pain. They don't want to be in pain. And I don't think even when, even the Christians in the first century, like when Peter writes his epistle to them, none of them want to be in pain. That's why he's telling them, hey, stand firm to the faith, and these things are going to happen, because, we don't want pain. Pain, like, even tests our faith. But, I don't want to experience a long, grueling death. Who doesn't want it to happen in their sleep or have it something that just hits and be done? I mean, that's just human. Even Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane asked for the cup to pass over him. Without going into a whole long sermon on that, he asked the Father if there's any other way, then if there's any other way that it could be done for that, because his human nature, his human side, didn't want to experience that pain on the cross. Yes. Thank you. All right. These kind of keeps coming. A man's spirit will endure sickness, but a crushed spirit who can bear? Well, that's got a lot in that verse. Thank you, Psalmist. All right. Let me look back on my notes where I'm at here. All right. So I guess maybe we can get through at least this next part. A crushed spirit who can bear. That kind of speaks magnitudes of just how devastating that is. So I got into pondering that verse you typed in there. And I can't speak on it without thinking on it even more. All right. So we're looking at verses 7 through 11. And these verses that we reach kind of also the problems in Job's friend's theology, where it kind of turns into prosperity gospel and word of faith preaching kind of has the same ideas of it in here. So his friend Eliphaz says, "Remember now, who ever perished being innocent, or where were the upright ever cut off? Even as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of his anger they are consumed. The roaring of the lion, the voice of the fierce lion, and the teeth of the young lions are broken. The old lion perishes for lack of prey, and the cubs of the lionesses are scattered." So here's the heart of the argument. And it's going to be what his friends go on and on and on about. They're saying, "Job, you're guilty because the innocent do not suffer like this." I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to post some notes in here. He's basically saying, Job, people who sow evil reap evil. And what's being said to Job is, you get what you deserve from what you did. Though you reap what you sow is not an absolute, it's a universal truth. I guess I should have written it as like a general truth. But we know with Job that he didn't sow evil. And so Eliphaz says, even as I have seen, those who plow iniquity and sow trouble reap the same. And it kind of makes you think if they really pay attention to the real world. Because it seems that they're so set in their ways, they must just justify their beliefs in whichever way they can in their mind. Well, because I mean that they have to. And I know this is kind of getting ahead of myself, but in Job chapter 12, Job kind of points out the real world to them just because of this in general, to appeal to reason. They were clueless of the actual fact. Absolutely. And as you see as we go through the book of Job, one thing that, we're going to end up seeing is that they always accuse Job of having sinned. But Job appeals to them and says, you've not said any sin that I've done, basically. You got nothing. You never said it. They never bring about a sin. But what I was saying with, as they speak, that, it seems that his friends have a warped view of the world, like they don't really pay attention, or they justify things in their mind to make their theology be correct. Because in Job chapter 12 and verse 6, he even says to his friend, the tents of robber prosper, and those who provoke God are secure in what God provides by his hand. And so, as we know, Job's friends live in a world which they believe good's rewarded, evil's punished. But Job in that chapter kind of points out to his friends at one point, says, hey, newsflash, guys, in case you aren't aware, in the real world around us, there's wicked people who are prospering or seem to be, and they're receiving punishment like me. And there are people who are mocking God in that home, living securely. They're not facing troubles like me, but it seems like they're doing okay. And so, granted, this is getting ahead of ourselves, but he's saying in that verse, in my observation, I'm being afflicted and they aren't. And as this pastor by the name of Gino, he comments, Job is pointing out that their view and their belief makes no sense. And Ecclesiastes. Oh boy, I love that book. I love them all. And yes, the heart of the children, man, is fully set to do evil. And that's an important thing right there. And that's one of those things that, there's men in this world, and without looking at my notes or thinking too hard on this, it's because that evil people do not see an immediate result of punishment for their evil doing, and it kind of seems like they keep getting away with it. That they continue to go forth doing evil, and they even dive deeper and deeper into it. IT, I could believe you on that for sure, because I've not really ever heard of many prosperity preachers speak on the book of Job, except for, let me pull up the verse, because there's one passage that I heard from prosperity teachers. I think it was in Proverbs 3. I'm going to pull that up really quick, and then I'll hand it over to violinist. It is this one, verses 9 and 10 of chapter 3. I've heard this one just because I agree with you 100%, but the one that I did hear from prosperity preachers, or at least preachers that I watched, whether they're prosperity or not, is 9 and 10 on tithing. They used it for tithing to say, and I think I heard prosperity preachers, I can't remember, but I remember speaking on that, as they use 9 and 10 of chapter 3 to basically tell people, hey, if you give God some, he will give you more. And they start saying, you got to give at least 10%. You got to give what you can. Basically, you give God $100, he'll give you $500. Theology like that, which is not theology, it's just horse crap. But yeah, so that's just what it made me think of. But what you said is, I haven't really heard other prosperity preachers preach on that, except for Joel Osteen. I speak against Joel Osteen on one of my studies, or actually on two of them. But Joel Osteen also uses what's that verse? See if it comes up really quick. Proverbs 18:21. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. Oh boy. Joel Osteen has a whole sermon, and he uses this verse in there in 18:21, that death and life are in the power of the tongue. But we kind of went over his sermon a little bit here and there in a study at church that I did, just because he ends up using that and using other verses to say that you can speak reality with your words, that you can speak things into existence. And, if you speak negative about yourself, then you're pronouncing negative on yourself. You say good things will come to you. Like Steve Harvey would say, you keep imagining yourself in that Porsche, and you're going to get that Porsche. Anyways. All right. I gotta stop myself here. Psalmist, guys, I really loved all this conversation, and I love this study that we had here today with y'all. I appreciate all the input, and that's absolutely a false gospel, Doty, as you said. And also violinist, you're absolutely right. Even, what was it Cleflo Dollar? A couple of them got their own jets, and Cleflo Dollar was just like, said he needed a jet for his ministry, and if God wanted to give him a rocket ship, then he'd give him a rocket ship. Anyways, you're welcome, guys. And I'm sorry, a pastor's name that sounds like a rapper, Cleflo Dollar, it just blows my mind that he didn't change that just for his ministry. But anyways, all right. Money, money, money. All right, violinist, I'm going to hand it over to you. If you want to go ahead and play on some violin for us, and I'm going to shut up now, and if I have anything to say, I will just type it in there. You're welcome, treasure. The one thing I always have to say is, anything I know or learn is God has shown it to me, and I can always have to point to that. because if it wasn't for him, this wouldn't be happening. That's
Move. Who's on? Oh. Oh. Oh, yeah. Okay. 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 This is good girl.